The following program is presented as a public service by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation.
It is a shame to burst the bubble of such a beautiful myth, but St. Patrick did not chase the snakes out of Ireland. There's a scientific explanation for that.
KTCA-TV, St. Paul, Minneapolis, presents Ireland Rediscovered, a series of 13 programs dealing with the significance of the Irish nation which has emerged to statehood in our own times. Dr. John McKiernan, head of the Department of English at the College of St. Thomas in St. Paul and an authority on Ireland, is host and lecturer. The title of this program is Who Were the Irish? Here again is Professor McKiernan.
Who were the Irish can be an interesting question. To answer it can require us to review a good deal of history, and I think enjoy it while we are doing it. But possibly before we ask the question or answer the question, who were the Irish, we might perhaps consider where they came from, where they live, what territory has been associated with their long history. Ireland is not a large country by American standards, only 32,524 square miles, approximately the size of the state of Maine, a little bit larger than South Carolina, and a little bit smaller than Indiana. Perhaps it's important to say it's 4 times the size of Massachusetts. Perhaps this explains why the Irish were able to capture Massachusetts. At any rate, the country is larger than several European countries. It is not the smallest country in Europe, and the comparative statistics, I think, help us appreciate the historical information which will shortly be disclosed. Ireland is 3 times the size of Belgium, 2.5 times the size of the Netherlands, twice the size of Switzerland or Denmark. And yet, though it is larger territorially than any of these European nations, its population is quite a bit smaller than any of those, even taken on an absolute scale, not a comparative scale. Even on an absolute scale, the Irish population is smaller than any of those European countries. As you can see from the map, geographically, the country is one. Historically, it is one. But in 1920, a British Act of Parliament partitioned the country, divided it into 2, so that today we customarily speak of Northern Ireland. This section, which was divided, broken off, partitioned from the rest of the country. The term perhaps is a bit awkward because the most northern part of Ireland now remains as part of Southern Ireland. Nonetheless, the terms are used. Northern Ireland and the rest of the country for a while was called Southern Ireland, but now more properly the Irish Republic. Now, Ireland, as you may note along this coast, has magnificent potential for harbors. We ought to make some mention of the physical features, the coastal indentations, because these actually have yet to be developed and even in their potential state offer magnificent possibilities for the future. These harbors are varied. Some of them, for instance, like this, are fjord-like. The indentations are deep and narrow. Others, for instance, are wide as bays, just as this illustration of the harbor in Galway. Still others are like wide river mouths, as this mouth of the Shannon, which incidentally may soon be developed into a very large harbor for the transshipment of ores and heavy merchandise to Europe, to and from Europe, I should say. We might mention that Ireland is a northern country. That is, it lies in the northern latitudes. It may be surprising to many of you to have it pointed out that Ireland is actually in the same latitude as Labrador. Despite the fact that Ireland lies so far north, its harbors are never frozen. Indeed, the country knows very little cold weather, as we know cold weather in America. Possibly it's a tribute to the efficiency of Irish planning to point out that Ireland has engineered the Gulf Stream in such a manner that the country is warmed by it. The average winter temperatures are only 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The summer temperatures, because of the northern position of the country, are quite temperate, about 60 degrees. This, of course, is a summer average. The sunshine in the months of May and June would vary from 5 to 6 hours a day. Certainly not as much as we're accustomed to in Arizona, but on the other hand, perhaps equal to that we find in other states of the United States. The annual rainfall is something that you may be interested in, much misunderstood perhaps, but heavy enough. On the eastern coast, let us say around Dublin, for instance, it averages about 30 inches a year. This is slightly less than what is to be had in New York City. On the western coast, the annual rainfall is approximately double that, about 60 inches. And this is close to what one gets in New Orleans or Miami. This does not mean, of course, this is simply a statistic, an annual average, a figure. It doesn't mean that one has the same kinds of rain, as it were. It does rain frequently in Ireland and England and Scotland, but the rainfall or the rainstorm is generally of briefer duration than what we have in the States. And therefore, though these figures may run approximately the same averages, I shouldn't like a New Yorker to think that because his rainfall is just a few more inches than that of Dublin, that it runs about the same. Now, we might mention another physical feature of the country, in fact, of the British Isles in general. And that is that both Ireland and England, now if you will allow this hand to represent Ireland, this hand to represent Britain, and the rest of the desk, the continent of Europe, I may make clear what I'm going to talk about in just a moment. Geologically speaking, Ireland and England are both part of what we call a submarine shelf. That is, an undersea extension of the continent of Europe. At one time, both of these countries were joined to that continent. And then the intervening land between Ireland and Britain sank, making an island out of Ireland. Ireland, after all, is simply mountaintops above the ocean. The land, the connecting land, the valleys between sank, thus isolating Ireland from England. And later the same thing took place between England and the continent, so that now we had these two islands separate from the continent, but at one time connected to it. Now, during the thousands of years that Ireland and England were connected, one to the other and then to the continent, during those thousands of years, after the great ice masses had receded and life became possible, the islands became habitable, during those thousands of years, life migrated from the continent. Animal life, plant life, migrated from the continent through England, Scotland, what we now call Scotland and Wales, in other words, through Britain, over to Ireland. And that's why there's such a similarity of life forms. However, between Ireland and England, this subsiding took place, so that those specimens of fauna and flora which reached Ireland were now shut off, at least comparatively speaking. I'm aware that the sea also brings life, and various seeds and spores are airborne, but they were comparatively isolated. And that isolation of Ireland took place before the snakes and toads arrived. And you see, although it's a shame perhaps to burst that little bubble, that beautiful tale, St. Patrick didn't banish the snakes. They were banished geologically. There's a scientific explanation. They just never got there, that's all. Well, this doesn't answer our question, who were the Irish? And I'm not losing sight of that, but I thought this background might be a bit helpful. Now, it's difficult to answer the question, who were the Irish? And it's complicated by the fact that they are the longest on their own soil of almost any race in Europe, excluding, of course, the Greeks and the Romans. This makes a special kind of problem, a great difficulty, really, because it suggests that there's an historical continuity that precedes historical knowledge. And all that we can say then is conjecture, however well controlled, but conjecture which is based upon archaeological and other kinds of findings. Poetically, you have probably heard the Irish referred to as Celts, C-E-L-T-S. Some people choose to call it Celts. But poetically, you have heard the Irish referred to as Celts. You have heard them referred to as Gaels, G-A-E-L-S. And these words, I think, require just a momentary explanation. They're part of the answer now to the question, who were the Irish? We might put it very briefly and say that they are largely Gaelic Celts. But that still doesn't help us too much. Who were the Celts, we might have to ask. And was anyone there in Ireland when the Celts themselves arrived? If the Irish are these Gaelic Celts, were their predecessors whom they found when they arrived? Well, we know that Ireland has been inhabited for thousands of years. And we know nothing, next to nothing, about these early inhabitants. We know that the Celts themselves arrived rather within historical times and found the country populated, perhaps not thickly, I don't want to mislead you, but there were people there. And those people have left artifacts, have left ruins, monuments, artworks, and so on, which we can examine. And I think perhaps we ought to point this out to you. It's a good suggestion of the antiquity of the country and of part of the difficulty in answering the question, who were the Irish? Now, the archaeological ruins most commonly found are what we call forts. There are about 35,000 of these forts in Ireland. Some of them, many of them, are of stone. Some of them are simply of packed earth. We hear the word today, fort, and we think of a military installation. You must banish that from your mind. We call these forts simply because they appear to be suitable for that type purpose. But actually, they were home installations. They were cattle compounds. They were simple elementary means of protection for a community of people. But they were not forts in the sense in which we generally speak of the term. I should like to show you an example of one of them called Dún Angus on the island of Arran, out into the rough Atlantic. We can show you an aerial photograph. It's a bit difficult to study, but if you look closely, in the middle of this, you'll see a semicircular fort, or such as I have just called a fort, On the edge of this huge cliff, that barrier through the middle of the picture is a cliff 300 feet high. Now, this fort is semicircular. On the edge of this cliff, originally we think it was a complete circle, which collapsed as the cliff collapsed over the past thousands of years. This fort, incidentally, is possibly 3,500 years old. The interior diameter, as you notice here, is marked. If you look carefully, you'll see a triple wall. Now, the innermost wall is 8 feet high, and the middle one 14 feet high. The outer one 20 feet high. The whole base of the fort is 18 inches thick. And this fort and its outer defenses, which remind you of a modern anti-tank trap, occupy 11 acres, a magnificent engineering feat, right on the edge of that cliff. And as I remarked before, almost 3,500 years ago, made almost 3,500 years ago. Now we have another type of very early Irish artifact, if you will. This is what we call a tumulus. It was a burial mound. And this is the entrance to one, a modern iron gate put up here. This burial mound occupies almost 1 whole acre. A circular mound. Notice these stones out here on the outside were incised with a geometrical pattern. This is a subterranean passage leading to the burial tombs. Well, these are works of antique engineering in Ireland done, as I say, anywhere from 1,500 to 3,500 years ago. We also have some artistic examples of these early settlers in Ireland. We have a gold necklace, for instance, which is probably close to 4,000 years old, with some magnificent work, as this tiny detail of one small part of it will show. Well, these were presented to you simply to give you some notion of the fact that the Irish island has been settled for a long, long time, going back into prehistory. Now, who were the Celts then? Well, the Celts were a European population. They were people who came from what is now southern Germany, eastern France, Austria. They came into prominence about 1500 BC. And then considerably later than that, about 1000 BC, they suffered an expansion movement which sent them north, south, west, even over into Asia Minor, that section that we call Galatia. And then possibly about 500 BC, again, this mysterious expansion, perhaps because of pressure from northern tribes, but for whatever reason, we can only surmise. They again spread, chiefly westward this time, into what we know as Spain and France today. Well, originally, you see, they came from the regions which are now drained by the upper Danube, by the Rhine, by the Rhone in France, and then spread themselves westward, and ultimately went to England and Ireland. Now we're getting a little bit closer to our answer. The Celts then were an early people in Europe who came to the attention of the Greeks and the Romans. In other words, one of the earliest identifiable groups of people on the continent of Europe, along with the Romans and the Greeks. As a matter of fact, the Greeks listed them as one of the 4 major peoples of Europe. And this listing, incidentally, several centuries before Christ. But now to get them to Ireland. The Celts then invaded England. In fact, this was their last conquest. The last conquest of this rather great, in one sense, people. Their last conquest was England and Ireland. And of that very, very ancient, what shall we call them, ancient mid-European peoples who had spread so wide over all of Europe. Of that very ancient people, only Ireland today maintains a state, a nation state. It's interesting when you think about it. The Welsh, of course, are Celts, but they have no state of their own. But if we include the Welsh and the Celts and the Scottish Highlanders, these are the chief descendants. We have some Bretons in France, also Celts. But of all of these, you see, it is Ireland today which is the only independent Celtic state out of this very, very ancient people. Well, now we have them in Ireland. When they came there, they found a people with a civilization about which we know not too much, but whose monuments we have shown, we have shown you a few examples. The Celts, however, had a superior technology. The secret of the Celtic success in Ireland was iron. They had, if you want to put it in modern terms, a superior firepower. They were a tall people, reddish blonde. We sometimes think of the typical Irishman as black-haired and so on. But this warrior class of Celts were reddish blonde, a tall people who had the secret of iron and who were thereby able to impose their will upon the inhabitants whom they found already in the country. Well, all we know is that the Celts, and of those Celts, the particular branch which we call the Gaelic Celts were able now to impose their will upon the inhabitants, to impose their language upon the inhabitants they found in Ireland. This wasn't done peacefully, we may assume, but at any rate it was thorough, it was complete. So now we're getting closer to our answer. Who were the Irish? Well, they were the fusion of this people, this old people, who had been able to undertake such remarkable engineering feats as you saw a bit earlier on the program, who had had an artistic sense. We showed you that one sample of some very ancient jewelry. It was the fusion of that old people with this new people, the people who had a superior technology, who brought iron, who had the gift of government, who had an oral literary tradition, which even on the continent had been quite extensive. Indeed, the origins of much continental folklore, for instance, goes back to the continental Celts. Well, when the Celts came to Ireland, they reverted to a form of monarchy in their rule. Caesar, Julius Caesar, in his commentaries, tells us that on the continent, the Celts had been governed by magistrates. Whether this is completely so or whether it was due to a misunderstanding, we can't be certain, but we know that more typically, they were much interested in the kingship. So that we do know in Ireland they reverted to the kingship. There were many kings because there were sections of the country were somewhat isolated, one community from another, and so on. The word for king in Ireland, I may use it during the program, is ri, R-I, ri. Well, the section of the country that was governed by a ri was called Tuath, T-U-A-T-H. Those of you who are interested in languages might like to know that this is related to the word Teuton, which we associate, you see, with Germany. But this word Teuton and the Gaelic or the Irish word Tua, which means country, originally meant people and then came to mean country. These two words are associated. Now, the king governed a Tua, a small little section of the land, and eventually several of these were amalgamated and we had an over-king. Again, we mustn't make the historical mistake of interpreting that word king or over-king in our sense of the word today, because these men were perhaps simply superior personalities. They weren't administrators with filing cabinets and hosts at their command. This is a rather interesting point, which will be developed at considerable detail in a much later program. You'll excuse me if I go on to mention the nobles and the commoners as two other classes. The commoners, I suppose, nothing was expected of them except that they work and pay their taxes and make no complaints. The nobles were the warrior class, the aristocratic fighters, if you will. But, and this is very significant, in ancient Ireland, the intellectuals, from whatever class they might come, because they could cut across class lines, to be an aristocrat or a noble required that you be born into it. But the intellectual could cut across all class lines, and that class existed in Ireland. A very interesting development, I think, and quite different from what we have in many civilizations. Now, these early Gaels then stamped the country, left their language upon it, left their system of government, the monarchy and the tuatha, and this organization and this intellectual class, which had the same rights as the aristocratic class. This persisted in Ireland down really to Elizabethan times. By the beginning of the 1st century, the Gaels had organized the country into 5 sections. We call these Cuigi, which is simply the Gaelic word for fifth. And these are the 5/5 of Ireland. And note how modern. Most of this is exactly what you have today. The lines have changed slightly, and that's about all. Well, now, if we come slightly past Christ's time, we come to a great administrator by the name of Cormac MacArt, who established the government, the high kingship of the whole country at Tara. You have probably heard that word before, T-A-R-A. And from Tara he built these 5 great roads. He was a great builder in every sense of the word, an administrator and builder. And this ancient depiction of these old roads will give you an illustration of the importance of Tara. All the roads of the country had to come to it. And then in the 5th century, we're taking you 2 or 3 centuries at a time, you notice, from the time of Christ's birth. We come to a great king at the very beginning of the 5th century by the name of Niall, or Neil, N-I-A-L-L, from whom the O'Neills are descended. See how old a name that is. By this time, Ireland was Gaelic, and the word Gael was a proud and haughty word. The entire country rejoiced in the language and culture of the Gaelic Celts. Who were the Irish? They were the fusion of an ancient prehistoric people and of the continental invaders known as the Gaelic Celts, who achieved a high civilization.
Ireland Rediscovered is produced by KTCA-TV, the Twin Cities Area Educational Television Corporation. The next title in this series is Raider to Artist. Host and lecturer is Dr. John McKiernan. Ireland Rediscovered is directed by Carl Brookins and produced by Joseph T. McDermott. This program was presented as a public service by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation.